Well, first of all, for those who heard me talk about this subject that I'll be talking about this morning last year at Tucson, I want to apologize because I took the easy way out. I thought it was going to be the easy way out. And I showed a British television documentary and then said, "Any questions?" And the trouble is that the screen was microscopic. It was a large auditorium and not too many people could see. And the sound was awful and almost nobody could hear. But this time I've been honest and a little industrious, so I've composed a speech. First remark. Second remark, I'm not quite as democratic as Ed York, and he announced at the beginning of this talk that interrupt me at any time, with questions or comments and so on, and I did, along with some others. My guess is it would probably be best if you heard me out instead of asking questions, and the reason being is that as I go along, after getting a question, I may see in this little outline that I've written the answer to the question, and that's going to embarrass me. So it's probably best if I just go through the whole thing, and then we can have at it in the way of questions, and you can lambaste me as much as you want, and so on, although I prefer questions rather than lambastement. All right, we'll get started here. And as you've gathered from the title of my speech that I guess Jane Orient made up, I'm going to talk about red mercury terrorist weapons. And these are essentially little, practically micro neutron bombs, extremely small size, but can be very insidious as terrorist weapons. But I'll get into that now. I'll start with some history. I don't see Edward Teller in the audience here. I hope. Where is he? Oh, Edward, hi. Long time no see. Okay. Sometime in the late 19th, see, I'm going to mention Edward, the late 1950s, and this is, very, very substantial measure due to Edward. A program got started in the Atomic Energy Commission at the Livermore Laboratory. It was called Project Plowshare. And they were looking at the peaceful applications of nuclear explosives to dig canals and loosen up ore deposits and all that sort of stuff. Now, what that called for was having the so-called clean nuclear explosive, namely that didn't spew out all the fission products that you get from, the regular fission explosives. Now, there were two tacks taken at the beginning. One was the easy way, to use a fission trigger to ignite a fusion secondary. And so the meaningful radioactivity would come out of this fission trigger, but the goal was to have the yield of the fission trigger as small as possible. And Livermore really sparkled back in those days in low yield weapons. And so they had a very promising future. And so what emerged from this fission fusion effort was a very successful series of testing back in the early 60s. And I'll dwell on this in a moment. Now, the other tack that the Livermore people took was to have a pure fusion weapon. And that represented a very formidable challenge. And the idea here was to take a really huge, massive, high explosive and turn it into a very sophisticated implosion assembly. And now all these shock waves would go racing through the high explosive, and they would impinge upon a little capsule of deuterium and tritium, which would then react thermonuclearly and cause a bang to take place. And originally they were thinking of a yield on the order of 10 tons. And from a nuclear investment standpoint, this was just dirt cheap. We were talking on the order of a gram of tritium, which back in those days was maybe a few $1,000s or so. And this was the nemesis of the anti-proliferation people, because it really opened Pandora's box up, but good. Okay. Now I mentioned, the fission fusion approach was by far and away, the easier. Now it happened to have some peculiar properties, as well as peaceful application. Namely, it had neutron bomb properties. And by the time it was successfully tested, the neutron bomb had become one of the high priorities in the Atomic Energy Commission. And Livermore was working very fervently at it. The trouble was, by the time it was tested, we had a new administration, Kennedy administration, and they didn't like any kind of bombs, and especially neutron bombs. And so nothing was done about this really tremendous Livermore success. It just worked out fabulously. Now, insofar as the pure fusion approach went, it flunked. And after some years, I forget how many, they stopped, to the enormous relief of the administration and all the arms controllers, because they were in the process of trying to get a non-proliferation agreement. And had this project succeeded, they could not, in any responsible way, have signed such an agreement. And so they were just hoping and praying that it would fail. And for the time being, it did. As a matter of fact, I don't want to get too lengthy, but I suddenly remember going into the Pentagon to brief a guy by the name of Paul Nitze, who became sort of the high priest of nuclear arms control. And he was in charge of arms control in the Pentagon. This is 1961. And when I told him about this little pure fusion device, well, it wasn't little, but the bang was little. Initially, it was called Dove, for Dove of Peace. But it's far more a dove of war than of peace regarding its implications. Well, he became very upset. I won't say, that he blanched, but darn near did. And not too long afterward, even though I've been practically commuting to Livermore, as Edward will recall very well, and was very instrumental in pushing both of these projects back in Washington and getting high priorities for them. Thanks to Nitze, after I left his office, he had the classification graded from secret to top secret, special access. And I wasn't allowed to find out what I had been promulgating. And that didn't rest very well with me. And it rested even more poorly with my pals who were working on it. They were really embarrassed to tears. They couldn't tell me. But that's the way games go. Now, going around the world a little bit, let me backtrack. Had this project succeeded, we would have had a device whose development could not have been monitored in any possible way. The bangs were too low, for any detection system to pick up. Since it used tritium, and the non-proliferation treaty terms did not include monitoring tritium production, any nation could have gotten off scot-free in developing these things. And as one individual, I fought to get tritium included in the MPT, but nobody paid any attention to me. Uppermost in the arms control business is getting treaties. And who cares less about implications? The important thing is having the treaty. And then stop worrying about it. Now, let's go on over to another part of the world. In the early 1950s, some years before Livermore began its Dove program, the Soviets began theirs. And they took essentially the same approach as Livermore, using this rather large mass of high explosive to implode some deuterium and tritium. And in 1957, the director of the Soviet project, who had formerly worked on the Soviet hydrogen bomb, and you probably met him, Edward, Artsimovich, Professor Artsimovich. You never met him? Well, I guess not all these hydrogen bomb guys knew each other. Okay. Well, the Soviets went to work on it, and ostensibly for the same altruistic reasons that we did, for peaceful application. And getting back to 57 again, Artsimovich presented a paper at an international conference on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. This was at Geneva. And he described this device and experiments that they had done that, unlike the Livermore experiments, had some modicum of success. And when I say some modicum of success, they detected a fair number of very high energy neutrons escaping the device. Now, not too long after this paper was issued, and I read it with fascination, I might say, the US neutron bomb debate began. And a lot of the details were leaked out to the press, came to the attention of the Soviet Union, and that was the first and last reporting of what I'll loosely call, Dufsky or something like that, pure fusion weapons developments going on in the USSR. And now what's interesting is that some 3 years after Artsimovich gave his paper at Geneva, a Soviet Army officer wrote an article in a very prestigious journal. It's called Red Star. And the article had to do with the military implications of Dove, or Dufsky. And he picked on a yield, which happened to be precisely the yield that Livermore had been interested in early on. And he described the weapons effects and discussed the military implications of these devices on the battlefield. And the implications were profound indeed, because it was a fantastically discriminate weapon, primarily being at such low yield. But the way neutrons behave, the lethal range of this weapon, the radiation range, would be roughly a half or so of a much larger yield neutron bomb, namely 100-fold greater or so. So, to repeat, it would have been an extremely effective and discriminate battlefield weapon. So the good colonel put out this report in this journal, and a copy of it came into my hands, and I read it. And regarding the technical details in the colonel's report, incidentally, he was a technical officer. They were one-on-one with the U.S. secret calculations. And I found that very intriguing. He had done a darn good job. Either that or And you know what the ore is, so there's no point in my repeating it. All right, now time marches on. There's a big gap, and I'm going to get around to why I'm standing here. We're now in the early 1990s, and I was long retired, but I've been in the nuclear weapons business for some 40 years, and it was in my blood, and I hadn't lost any interest in the issues. And whenever possible, I'd read literature or see it on television, and then I still had some friends left from the good old days, and they were collectors, and they would send me articles, and I would read and see all this stuff. And gradually, something began to work itself up in my mind that told me that something very brand new, as far as I knew, was afoot in the no longer Soviet Union, now Russia, regarding this dove device, but with a different implosion technology involving a substance that got an awful lot of publicity called red mercury. Now, red mercury allegedly, according to a lot of the articles that I read, and also people that I spoke with, who were uncleared, which gave them the ability to talk. And since I lost my clearances by then, I could talk as openly as I wished. And what I gathered, that this red mercury, which originally had been discovered by scientists working on industrial applications of explosive materials, had been discovered during the 1960s by both the Americans and by the Soviets. But now there was a new kind of red mercury afoot, not the old-fashioned kind, which just didn't behave like the old-fashioned kind. It also didn't behave like regular explosives. And according to all these reports, it had fantastic energy density properties. Now, in the US, we refer to the general class of materials, including red mercury, as ballotechnic materials. And these ballotechnic explosives, they just don't behave like explosives are supposed to behave. They don't go bang and you have a cloud, and you have a mushroom and a lot of smoke and so on and so forth. They remain geometrically approximately as they were before being detonated, either in solid or in gel form. But they get hot. Oh boy, do they get hot. And so, as I began to learn, it seemed possible, even probable, and in my mind, essentially a done deed, that this special brand of red mercury, from what I gather again, and this is from unclassified sources, it was produced by taking normal red mercury, which is a mercury antimony oxide, highly compressing it, immersing it into a nuclear reactor, bombarding it with neutrons, then after some period of time, withdrawing it, and now you have the real red mercury, which is capable of these unbelievable deeds. And slightly radioactive, but only slightly, and it has an effective half-life of only a couple of days or so, which means that after a month or two has gone by, the radioactivity has essentially disappeared. But it seemed to have, as I've mentioned, this fantastic energy density that would make possible a device roughly the size of a baseball, and I'm just making this up, weighing in the range of 5 to 10 pounds. That would be a mini neutron bomb that would deliver lethal doses, super lethal doses, out to like about 1/3 of a mile. And I got my hands on an awful lot of material to support what I've just told you. Okay. Now the story goes on. Thanks to Glasnost, the Soviet Union, which was one of the most secretive societies on Earth, now became Russia. And with Glasnost, it just opened up wide. And the Russians, the military and the scientific types, would talk about almost anything, just very, very freely. And if they'd done so 10 years ago or before, they would have been led down into a dungeon and shot in the back of the head, very unceremoniously. But now they just felt free to talk their heads off. And like, for example, the director of the Russian Atomic Energy Commission, he spoke freely about third generation of nuclear weapons that were going to be a very low yield, very discriminate, and he described their application on the battlefield. Well, the chief was talking about little neutron bombs that I'm talking about today. We had a Russian official, a civilian, who said that within this class of third generations was a weapon so small as to be roughly the size of a hand grenade, but so powerful it could blow a ship out of the water. We have a military officer who claimed that you could reduce the weight of a warhead by 100-fold and yet double the yield at the same time. Now, anybody that knows anything about nuclear fission weapons knows that's absolutely impossible, because you'd wind up with a weapon that consisted only of a small amount of plutonium. So it had to be a fusion device, namely one of these baseball-sized, that I'm conjecturing, devices. And all this stuff came out. Now, I may sound egotistical here, but as far as I know, I was the only guy that collected all this and took it seriously and put together a story. Now, what I also began to find out is that the Russians, with full blessings of their president, Boris Yeltsin, were smuggling the real red mercury. This was under the auspices of the KGB. Now they're called the Federal Security Service. Sounds very innocuous, but it's the same gang, of cutthroats. And then you add to that a new gang of cutthroats that emerged once the Soviet Union broke up, namely the Russian mafia. And these guys were peddling red mercury around and selling it at the highest price, or to the highest bidder, at just astronomical prices. Just exactly how much I don't know, and my guess is it varied depending upon the purchasing country, but there were numbers that came out openly that it was being peddled at like about $100,000 a kilogram. Well, that's pretty expensive, but considering what you can do with it, that cost is piddling It's absolutely pilling. And to repeat myself on the tritium investment, we're talking about a grand's worth, and that's piddling, considering the consequences of using these weapons. Now, as to who was buying red mercury, almost everybody. And it all came out, except that the United States didn't seem to be buying it. And for one very simple reason. The official position of the US government was that the red mercury was non-existent. And even though the government can do some foolish things every once in a while, or even downright stupid, it's not that stupid to buy a non-existent material. But what you and I know is the CIA had its guys all around Europe picking up this stuff and bringing it on back home where it was analyzed and so on. What the results were of these analyses not being cleared, I can't say anything. Now, other countries that were the recipients of red mercury sales, which I might say was a fiercely competitive business, and it was just grisly. They were the most awesome, horrible murders involving mutilation imaginable in competing for this stuff. But other countries, and I'll start off with the best example of all, included Iraq. And when the Gulf War was over, the UN sent this inspection team into Baghdad. It was an IAEA inspection team, and they probed around, and they finally wrote up a report on what they discovered. And there was no mention of red mercury in the report. But what they found were voluminous files of red mercury transactions. When the head of the U.S. part of the contingent was asked about this, how come the red mercury files weren't reported in your final report? His rather sarcastic response was, "Why don't you guess?" That was a very dishonest and potentially dangerous omission, in my opinion. Now, we'll get around to a few other nasty countries. Libya was buying it up. Iran was buying it up. Pakistan was buying it up. North Korea was buying it up. And all these are officially recognized terrorist countries. So I began to get more and more worried. Okay, finally I thought I had enough information so I could sit down and write an article. And I did, and it wasn't easy to get it accepted. And I submitted it to National Review, a nice conservative magazine. I'm a nice, or not so nice, conservative guy, but I'd always gotten along famously with National Review, and I was a pal of Bill Buckley. He really liked me, and so on and so forth. And I thought I wouldn't have any trouble. Well, it took months for them to finally get around to accepting it. And even then, it came out at the very back of that particular issue, which says something about nuclear politics and terrorism in particular. But anyway, it did come out. This is in December 1944. Okay, now...
Date, I'm sorry, December?
I beg your pardon?
December 94?
December 1994. Okay. All right, out comes my article. And it's 99 and 4,400% ignored. But that remaining fraction of percent turned out to be very meaningful. Almost immediately, I got a call from a fellow by the name of Frank Barnaby. I suspect that a lot of you here have known about him. A nuclear physicist who had originally worked on the British nuclear weapons program, but then he got a conscience and he quit, and he became a peacenik, and he wound up heading for quite a few years this Stockholm Institute, Peace Institute, which is world famous. And so he became very anti-nuclear and dedicated to peace. And he called me from London, and he just read my article, and he was excited beyond compare. And turned out that he'd been looking into red mercury himself and had learned an awful lot, because his position on nuclear arms control was diametrically opposed to that of most of the West, but certainly diametrically opposed to that of the US. And he was just essentially 100% in bed with the Soviets. A lot of people accused him of being a communist, which I don't think he was, but they loved him in the Soviet Union. And he met all of their nuclear scientists and became pals with them. And he was simply adored over there, and had access of a kind that the CIA could only dream of having, which I don't think he ever reported. But at any rate, he had been looking into red mercury, and had, along with a British TV documentary producer, they had already put out one documentary on red mercury, which sort of implied that it could be useful for getting a very small, efficient fission weapon. But he never thought of a pure fusion weapon, which was the basis of my National Review article. Well, he wanted to do another documentary, starting off by interviewing me and then some others, and then going off to Russia, where he was more than welcome, and interviewing his Russian nuclear scientist pals. And so another documentary came out, and it centered on pure fusion. And one of the scientists that he interviewed had been working with red mercury toward using it to make nuclear explosives. And the scientist didn't read English or speak it, and he had an interpreter read my National Review article off to this scientist who was a nuclear chemist. And he gasped, and he says, "Where did this come from?" So it was explained to him. He says, "Well, who is this person, Sam Cohen?" I was explained to him. And then he was queried, "Well, do you think that Sam Cohen's right?" And the answer was, "Yes, he is." "Do you have these devices in Russia?" "Yes, we do." And then he chopped off the interview, saying, "This is becoming very dangerous." And that was the end of the interview. Now, that was one happening. So I went the glamour route. I got on television. And secondly, I had a former commie actually agree with me, and I've always been virulently anti-communist. And that was, extremely flattering for me. Okay, now, two other things happened, and that's all, but both very meaningful. I received a call from an old pal of mine at Los Alamos. He'd read my National Review article. And he got very excited and invited me to come up to the laboratory as quickly as possible to lead a seminar on the subject. And I said, boy, I can hardly wait to come, but I was aching and paining with a bad back or something like that. And I couldn't come right away, but he said, you've got an indefinite rain check. And, the sooner the better. We really want you to come on up and discuss this. Well, all of a sudden, so you talk about security. In my opinion, the United States has always had lousy nuclear security, even though it's tried to put the greatest emphasis on it imaginable, as Ed York, put out, this morning about this top secret document, going on, remaining top secret. From 45, if I remember, to 89. It's some 4 decades worth or so. The truth of the matter is, literally within a matter of months, it was leaked out to the press about the third atomic bomb, an implosion plutonium bomb. But yet, before the contents of this letter off to the chief of staff got out, close to 45 years had gone by. So we profess to be fanatic about security, but in practice, it was lousy, just from the word go. And one of my great heroes, again, is Edward Teller, who's always been in favor of disbanding with this ultra secrecy. That if anything, it's just counterproductive, and he's always been dead right, and still is. It's just plain stupid. First of all, you can't keep the secret anyway. And secondly, you're depriving a lot of guys who can use this technical information to good avail for mankind's benefit, not necessarily for mankind's destruction. But so much for that. At any rate, I had to defer on going to Los Alamos, and then I got another call from an old military pal of mine. And he was now living in Santa Fe, and he had started a consulting organization, and a great deal of his consultation was with the Los Alamos laboratory. And he was using some of the Los Alamos people as consultants to his company, and then others, the Los Alamos, who were retiring, he would hire to join up with his company. So he was very close to Los Alamos insofar as his activities go. Okay, he'd read the article, my article, and told me that he's not a nuclear physicist or a nuclear weapons expert, but the people that worked for him were, and he said that all of them had the greatest of compliments from my article. Boy, I was really flattered. And he wanted to make me a consultant to his organization. Well, again, I was highly flattered that somebody would want to bring me back into the business, because when I left as one of the most unpopular guys in the United States government, because I've been speaking out and up against what I consider to be stupid nuclear policies. And they didn't like it one bit. So when I finally called it quits, my security clearance disappeared with the speed of light. At any rate, the retired general heading up this company said, I'd like to make you a consultant, and I'll get your clearances back as quickly as I can. And he could have done it. He's a real political operator and has a lot of contacts. Well, becoming a consultant, that's just great with me. I'm always willing to pitch in and try and be of help. Getting my security clearances, no way, because he was out to muzzle me, and I knew it. And but nevertheless, he brought me aboard as an uncleared consultant and has never used me. Now, I told him that I was so impressed with these little red mercury pure fusion warheads that I was thinking seriously about writing an article on ABM applications, because since these things are radiation emitters, you can create a plasma field, and when a reentry vehicle comes plowing back into the atmosphere and hits this plasma field, it can be seriously deflected, maybe even destroyed. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, even a little less than a few years, shortly after President Clinton came into office, he had a meeting with Yeltsin up in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he not only got together with his pal, Boris, but our scientists got together with Russian scientists, and the Russian scientists proposed a joint effort on using plasma ballistic missile defenses. And we turned them down for very mysterious reasons. But anyway, getting on back to my idea of writing this article, he says, great idea. He's very pro-ABM. He says, but please, Sam, he said, don't mention the word red mercury. Well, if there was ever a dead giveaway, there it was. And he didn't even realize, what he told me. But he had confirmed, see, what I had been speculating on, to a certain degree. All right, now, I've already discussed a little bit the military implications of these little neutron devices, and they're pretty profound, to put it mildly. But now there's another area of application, and that's nuclear terrorism. And in my mind, these things represent, and I'm not trying to be overly melodramatic here, they represent the ultimate terrorist weapon. Now, all you guys have very fertile imaginations, and you can concoct any scenario you want about a device roughly the size of a baseball that has a lethal radius going out to about 1/3 of a mile or so. And if you were, if you had a fiendish evil mind like I do, how would you use it as a terrorist? Well, the first thing that I thought of was doing in the administration. And which gives you a slight hint that I'm not enamored of the current administration. But on the other hand, there have been very few administrations I've been enamored of on both sides of the political aisle. Let's just suppose that some innocuous-looking person, he doesn't have to be an Arab or Muslim-looking type, with a fez on his head or something like that, or a turban wrapped around. You look like all-American person, just as innocent as they come. And he or she decides to have lunch in Lafayette Park, or the person might look like one of the homeless that dwell in Lafayette Park, right across the street from the White House. And so this person decides to have lunch, reaches into this bag, a fairly strong paper bag, and takes out a salami sandwich and munches away, and then reaches into the bag and does something, folds up the bag, dumps it into a trash container, and very calmly walks off. And a few minutes later, pop. Not nuclear bang, but pop. Because we're talking about a bang here, with respect to blast, not of 10 tons, but closer to 1 ton. Because most of the energy from these deuterium-tritium reactions go into the neutrons, not into blast and heat. So it would be a relative pop. Now, it would be large enough to break all kinds of windows in the area, but it would be the quintessential neutron bomb toward killing people and destroying property, and not destroying property. Now, within the White House and the Executive Office Building, you would have a lot of dead people. If they weren't dead almost immediately, depending upon how close they were to the explosion, the president would be closest, since faces his office, the Oval Office faces Pennsylvania Avenue. Nevertheless, the great bulk of the occupants of the White House and the EOB would be goners. Some would die sooner than later, depending upon how close they were to the explosion. And there goes the administration. Now, a pal of mine has had an even more fiendish scenario, and I'll give this, and then I'll stop and let you make up your own. He said, "Hey, Sam," he says, this is terrible enough, but I've got an even better one. How about the evening that the president gives his State of the Nation address to the Congress?
Excuse me, I find this highly insulting and out of order, and I would like you to stop saying these things unless you get a majority vote of this group that you should be permitted to go on saying these things.
Right.
Boy, that's a very sweet statement.
That's right, and I'm the president of this organization, and I'll exercise my
I
my
second
authority to
the
do that.
motion.
Okay. If you can't speak more politely and more appropriately, Sam, get off the podium.
Look, Howard, if you're president, I'm stepping down. I used to be in the Army, and I know how to take orders. So if some of you haven't enjoyed what I've been saying, I'm sorry, but I won't apologize. And that's it. And thanks so much.
May I have the floor for a moment?
Yes,
We
sir.
only have the 10 minutes of questions, Dr. Keller, obviously.
This happens to be a very important issue. This happens to be a very important organization. I think a part what has been said is correct. A part of it is completely incorrect and without foundation. And I know. What is correct is that pure fusion has been going on. What may be correct is that this could have military significance. What is also correct is that efforts of this kind have been going on in the Soviet Union. And what is furthermore correct is that people in Los Alamos, with whom I have consulted in detail, are working with the people in the Soviet Union on pure fusion for the time being in a completely open fashion. The honest opinion is that military applications or practical applications of this kind is not in the picture at the moment, but might come into the picture. This, I think, is correct. Red mercury is nonsense. I could not find any physical evidence anywhere, classified or unclassified, that is pure imagination, that it may be a hoax by the mafia, that some people are paying money for it is true. I believe, however, that there is here a basic new discovery, for that is not a particle of evidence that this could be at present something important for the terrorists is, I think, nonsense. What you people are doing here is to think of very serious dangers, and I think you should not waste your efforts to consider pure build-up of imagination and the mafia.
Incidentally, I've bowed out, but am I allowed to respond to Edward
Of course,
or
you have been
well,
very complimentary. I hope
well, I
you
want
will
the
be again.
Edward, I want the president's permission. You know, he's a boss man.
Now, you have the right to finish your appropriated time in your question period. Who is the master of ceremonies, Art?
I think it's most appropriate. He has another 7 minutes, and
Fine.
he'll be able to say what he wishes.
I'm allowed to go on? Well, thank you for the opportunity. I partially agree with Edward and partially disagree with him. So we've broken even. I'll try talking a little more rapidly here and finish up. I'll do the best I can. All right, now, so much for the horrendous scenario business. As I said, you know, over your martini, you can concoct better ones than I have. Okay, now, let's talk about the Los Alamos effort that Edward has brought up. And it was obvious to me when I got a call from my pal at Los Alamos, they were working on it. And indeed they have been. Now, how far can this Los Alamos effort go toward proving out the feasibility of these explosives? And the answer is not very far, because a couple of years ago or so, the Congress, in all of its wisdom, passed legislation forbidding the development and testing of all nuclear devices having yields less than 5 kilotons. And here we're talking about the ton range. So they'd be breaking the law by trying to test these things out. It doesn't make any sense. All the rest of the world can go as far as they want. But we can't. We can barely get to first base. Doesn't strike me as very sensible. All right, now, Edward has mentioned that we're cooperating with the Russians. Now, when I suspect most of you people heard Edward say this, you know, you were amazed. Because, you know, can you imagine, you know, a dozen years ago, cooperating with the Russians on such devices? Well, it happens to be true. Now, I didn't find it out for the first time after listening to Edward. I found it out some weeks ago in reading my local newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. And one of their science reporters went up to Los Alamos, and he interviewed various people. And in one particular interview, he got together with a scientist who's deeply involved in nuclear proliferation. And this fellow said, very proudly and very openly to the reporter, that Russian scientists were actually demonstrating their pure fusion expertise to Los Alamos scientists at two places. In Russia, where this fellow had gone a number of times, where they would actually detonate the device that would go pop. And he bragged about, you know, watching this, because, you know, it was a momentous episode in history. They also, these scientists came from a laboratory which was the equivalent of Los Alamos. It's called Artemis 16 in Russia. Now, they not only demonstrated these devices to Los Alamos scientists, but they were invited to Los Alamos to set one off on the laboratory grounds, not in the office area, needless to say, but some distance off where it would be safe. And I'm now quoting from the LA Times article that the Russians came out to test a high explosive fusion reactor. He used the word reactor, I guess, for the unwashed reader who equate reactors with bombs in a lot of cases. But at any rate, I'll repeat, to test a high explosive fusion reactor similar to the implosion devices, that trigger a nuclear warhead. We fired the first Russian implosion device on U.S. soil. Now get this one, and I don't know what to make out of it. It was delivered by Federal Express, not by an SS-19 missile. Now, I might say it sounds very plausible to me that it would come FedEx. You wouldn't want to try and sneak it by, this X-ray machine at regular airport or something like that. And you could have the device flown off from Russia, someplace, to Washington, D.C., where it would park where foreign airliners park with full diplomatic immunity. The airplanes can't be searched. And then they could have very well put it on FedEx if they chose to do to, and have it shipped off to Los Alamos. And if it's as small as I suspect it is, just no sweat. I'm gone. Well, that's it. I'm gone. So if anybody, thank you, very much for tolerating me as long as all this. Well, too bad. I've got some more interesting tidbits, but I will not pass on. And so, again, thanks a lot.